press. Okay, so Douglas has let me know he's good with the recording. Over to you.
Well, I normally print out what I'm going to read, but I'm not near my printer. So I've done a selection of poems from, I think, all of the collections, but we'll see how it works out for time. I'll start with a poem from my first collection, Reassembling World, and it's the last poem in the book. I might mention that in the ancient Greek world, dolphins and porpoises in the sea were viewed as messengers of the gods. Like Fernando Pessoa, I seem to be occupied by a few different imago, what I call imago writers. They seem to be almost self-contained writers or voices within one, and different kinds of poems come out according to each writer. And each has his or her characteristic voice. Hopefully, this evening's selection will reveal some of that sense of different imago writers inhabiting one person. The first poem tonight, I'd say, is very much in the tradition of the symbolists and the emmeticists, let us call them that. It's called The Meal. I threw my anger into the sea. It grew a shell around itself. The harvesting of broken waves brought a small boat home to me. I gave my anger up to the wind. An ocean of clouds hid the sun. Winter's world is a whitened page on which to walk a troubled mind. I buried my anger in the ground with stones above to keep it down. The wind whipped up a storm of leaves and whirled them round and round. I swallowed my anger finally. In the mirror of an empty plate, dolphins tear the shining skin to breathe and sing. Sing to me. I'm going to read one poem from my second collection, The House in Pella District. It fits, I suppose, in the narrative tradition with, let us say, something of a metaphysical twist and a clear use of language in a deliberately rich way to generate something of a reverberating music in the lines. The poem is called Blue Dragonflies. Attached in tandems, the stop and go, tarantella, aerial, zigzagging, acrobatic show proceeds strophe after strophe to mesmerize an audience of grass, wind, and sky. Sunlight low over lake water, somnambulant, metallic and flat, barely able to reflect the scene conceived as perpetuum mobile, the endlessly alive and effortlessly being. What summons to this place year after year the massed accolades to fertility, these shimmering duets of lapis lazuli? Flight's miracle engineers and domains of inches and feet, they cavil, they flick or hang suspended, immobile in the still air of morning, clouded by pollens from clumps of flowers and tufts of grass. Perhaps the fading away in the light of day, moon's cogs and wheels driven with a subtlety that defies our constant uncertainty? A bearded god with horns and hooves? Exquisite interconnection. Deus ex machina, necessity's god author, assumes authority for moon and dragonfly dancing ancient themes, performed impeccably. The hum of thin winged sounds in concert with Ursa Minor, while underneath the mirror, slowly waving their delicate pink fins, fat perch jostle for the morning's feast. An epithalamium is a song or a poem in honor of a bride and bridegroom. It's a marriage song. I think here in the poem that I'm about to read from the house in Pella district we're back in the traditions of the symbolist poets. The marriage is not between, say, a woman and a man, or a woman and a woman, or a man and a man, but rather between the seeker and the source, as in alchemical thinking of the past. Epithalamium. Up through the feet comes the nature of adored earth, its miraculous being, unlike those of the field, or birds angled in flight, we're upright, like the trees, in winter turned in summer out, in April exult, through October contemplate how a leaf falls, or the shadow of one on a forest floor. Read our small fate. History's ruined gardens do not reveal, promise to comfort the heart in its dreams of progression. Growth's quanta are discreet, the music beguiles, the gods sit and grin. A year passes, then two, and then many. Scourged, the disciple petitions not for plenitude, but mercy's relief. And then the giving, then redemption, to thrill the morning with rhythms that match our imaginings, valediction of desires passing. The mask dissolves beneath an infinitely precarious touch that seeks another, not for itself, but to give. Give. This poem from my third collection, The Unspoken, is, I think, characteristic of many of the seemingly straightforward narrative poems given me to write. Ones where narrative framework is there to carry, rather than a simple story, more to carry psychological states. The poem is in part informed by its time of publication, 1988, when the country was at perhaps its most tense political time. The poem is called The Message. Above the sounds of bathwater being run, or between a door closing and music beginning, or even in the middle of the long silence that accompanies tangled hours of thinking about illness and pain, a water pipe pings with the same note as the telephone as it just begins to ring, leaving the listener uncomfortably half standing, or half sitting, or halfway across the room, or half turned away from, staring at the sea, alert and wondering, is this it? The call that brings a message no one wishes to receive. Death, the last word of a love affair, a warning of danger, undesirably near. But it doesn't ring. Instead, a car passes noisily in the street below. A door slams shut and hurried footsteps descend a staircase. The distant wailing of a siren rises and falls along the uneven pattern of buildings, and the rain, after 5 unrelenting days, keeps on going, tick, 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 on the window panes. And this is also from The Unspoken and plows roughly the same sort of field as The Message. Again, the evocation of states of mind in a time in which all of the anchors of one's life are loose and being dragged about politically in the febrile atmosphere of the country of that time. And the poem is called From the Back Door. Nothing may come to visit us, or nothing more, and the night's small orchestra playing without our asking beyond the back door. Nothing may happen in the garden, or nothing more than the growth of grass and a tall tree recording our histories in a ring. Nothing may threaten us from the edge of sight and sound, or nothing more than storms that fall on house and hedge. Nothing moves around us where we sleep, or nothing more than air above dreamers who dream of weeping and awaken to weep. Stars wheel through each zodiacal sign. Morning after morning, nothing's changed, or nothing more than a star's fall from time, and what is still left for us to endure. One more from the unspoken. I've never quite been certain how to describe this one. It is, in one way, a narrative, but it also deploys an extension of metaphor. It's a kind of paean to geology. I'm grateful to all the authors whose books on geology and the history of the planet have afforded me a proper sense of time and place and being. And the poem is called The Book. Strata of stone millennia deep reveal a long history of land and sky. Time's telescope of all that's grown up from and returned to ground. Up, formed and decayed and blown away, replaced, blown away and replaced again. Ice intermittently arrives and keeps the rocks and water locked in groaning frozen sheets of white until they melt and leave behind signatures scarred into stone, deep piles of pebbles and detritus. Land rises up or sinks, mountains soar and wear away, wide lakes and winding rivers fill and dry to salt and sulphur that preserve the bones of animals that return year after year to bend and drink and die as edges slowly recede. 50,000 years of wet and then 50,000 dry. Chips and flakes, whole words packed into layer on layer, are revealed in rainstorms for reading by the man out walking one day, stalking himself, seeing his being. The next poem comes from the Middle Years and is more in the Imagist tradition, I suppose, but with an added metaphysical twist. And the poem is called Witness. A yellow moon lies on the sheets, inhabits the glass, and soon will sink behind the hill's dark edge, dissolve into the ocean. The silhouettes of chairs and table sliding across the walls and floor, they and the sleeper disappearing as deeper darkness floods the door. But before it goes, it softens the lines of hip and breast and shoulder under bluish cloth containing breath's body growing older. In a house that's new, the imagination's geographies confused by sound. Strange angles, echoes, distances, deep sighs from roof and ground. The histories of inhabitants, like fine dust, linger in the air. Unable to sleep, you wander through room after room, trying to fathom the faint refrains sensed there. It's so funny as I read in the background, there's one of those churches that does an awful lot of singing in the background with music, and it's actually quite useful in a way. It provides a sort of musical, rhythmic background to my reading, and they really go at it. The next poem, also from the middle years, is what I would call discursive. It's primarily a poem of discussion of ideas that uses a narrative framework. And in this particular case, it's an epistolary work, a poem in a form of a letter written to a very good friend of mine who died in 2009, I think it was, Don McLennan. And the poem is prefaced by a quotation from Montale, from his poem Su una lettera non scritta, on an unwritten letter, which is from his collection La bufera e altro, The Storm, and other poems. And the quotation is, ben altro è sulla terra. There is more on earth than this. And the poem was written in the bath, actually, which I was sitting in the bath, having a hot bath, and that's where it began. And echoing Montale's poem, which is one of his great poems, so it's a bit cheeky of me, I suppose, but I called the poem On a Letter Not Sent, and the title itself is also the first line of the poem, and it's dedicated to Don McLennan, 1929, 2009. On a letter not sent, that began early one morning as a discussion on the differences between the abstract and the personal in writing, and how one might tell one from the other. The simple answer was, with consummate difficulty. It was never sent, not even written. One more exchange composed in the bath at 5 a.m., part of a conversation going on intermittently for almost a quarter of a century. Nothing needed to be said just then, while the possibility existed of another visit late in the year on a trip to sell those books that would most probably not be bought, doomed to yellow in shop windows, grow fragile in the sun. Sitting in the garden, in a lucid moment, you would say, but that is not what matters. That's not what matters at all. Time always heals and justifies. At best, one can converse with friends, yes, but what speech that is. Ah, Donald, would that that old canard of history redeeming actually helped for all of us now, but it doesn't, not here, and it won't in the years to come. It's in the doing, you'd say, with passion, smoke drifting up from a cigarette. Getting from here to there, you walk one step after the other. It sounds absurd to say so, but that's why you say, that's why, stabbing the air with a finger. Yet still there remains everything to say, the years continuing to bring. No closer horizons that stubbornly remain, always just beyond our reach. Only words, unwritten, unsent, go on echoing in the turbulent air that always separates, remains between. I started the next poem, also from the middle years, in the 1980s, and after much struggle shaping it, years and many, many versions, I think I managed to finish it in the early 1990s. A mix of narrative, imagist, and declarative modes. It holds some interest, for me at least, uh, because of its early expression of an awareness of the issues of global warming and pollution. It's called A Line of Trees, Low pressure ridging over the land brings rain and wind and a darkened afternoon. By the time it's evening, nothing's left untouched, as walls of air from the southern ocean sing hard through the leaves on eucalyptus trees, cascading all night like flooded mountain streams. When finally it's morning and everything is stilled, the great unfolding blaze of daytime on the roofs brings out dogs and people on journeys to and from familiar destinations, open gates and gardens, meetings on street corners and secret assignations in the shadowed world of entrances to buildings. How solid it seems, how permanent and real. The long rows of houses that flow up and down, roads of cobblestones from the 19th century. Giant cranes in the harbour that stoop to lift and move bales, crates, and bags out of and into ships. The bay's yawning tie line curving north and west. Yet even as the dance of light begins to alter, casts of colour on the roofs and walls, our folly and ignorance of seeing everything unwritten. States and nations come and go, but only once. Once only, our one and only atmosphere. Heat or ice will come, but much too much of it. In a scene in a dream that repeats each night, a man struggles to walk across an empty field. Caught in mud up to his knees, he takes minutes to make each step, an hour to walk 10 meters. No matter how he tries and tries, he never seems to reach the safety of a line of old oak trees. The Middle Years was published in 1993, and then there was a very long gap in my publishing history until through the good services of my friend Gus Ferguson, Blue Rivers was published in 2011. It was roughly 18 years. And for the first sort of 10 of those years, I didn't write pretty much at all. Much like Paul Valery, though I hesitate to place myself in such elevated company, but Paul Valery, the great French poet, had a similar fallow period. And after the initial fallow period of about 10 years, it took another 5 to develop a new sense of writing, something that could carry me forward again. And that had much to do with examining what it is the impetus to write is. And I created this character, if you will, called the Muse, a kind of an other and almost an alter ego, I suppose. But what I did was visualize the Muse as a genuine, actual other, someone who could talk to you and someone who would talk to me, and she would get very shirty with me and more than often would be castigating me and chastising me in one way or another. And it led to some wonderfully strange but interesting poems and opened up a kind of new channel of writing. So the collection Blue Rivers tonight will be represented by the first and last poems, Beloved and The Life of the Mind. Beloved was kicked off while reading an interview of James Coetzee in an American magazine. I cannot remember who the interviewer was. And he asked J.M. To whom he wrote. And John's answer was quite oblique. The beloved, he said. And that set off a whole period of wondering in me. I wondered what he meant. Some months later, I'd fashioned a kind of answer or an accompaniment or, well, not quite a rejoinder. And this is the poem that resulted, called Beloved. How on earth can I say it out loud? That which is always just beyond reach, the tongue a closed hand without the required dexterity to handle such pressures of speech. For exactly when we entrust to language what we meant or we mean, it disappears. A theatre emptying as though on fire, and except for that ghostly cast of old fears that crowds the air and attends each minute, we are left to wander, lost in the mist of where we've been and all that we did. Fading annotations on a lengthening list, the body's blind passions rendered in ink. Yet you are undimmed. All the books in which I would wish to spend my days were I able to choose. And your looks are precisely the reprieve that I take to be what I want each time that I wake. The Life of the Mind is prefaced by a quote from the selected poems of Jorge Luis Borges. And the particular poem is called The Art of Poetry. And I won't butcher the Spanish, but the translation is transform the indignity of the years into a music. The poem is called The Life of the Mind, and it references not only Borges, but also Nabokov, who was a great lepidopterist, a collector of butterflies, which I know everyone has opinions and feelings about that, but so it goes. So it kind of, in a way, uses these two writers as I guess, a needle and thread to run through the fabric of the poem. Hopefully, the life of the mind. The possibility of meaning never ceased to tantalize him. Halfway across the world, he knew others were working just as hard to ward off the Gorgon's gaze. Frugality and restraint were the gestures aimed at redemption, or at least the thought of it. For passion, he chose the observation of clouds. Sunsets, inexhaustible portmanteaus of the heart, were always the preferred trope, while the least prospect of a common blue waltzing slowly through the haze of summer's gloaming was the singular thing that kept him going, despite memory's heartache, the thousand blows. Title of my next book, Liminal, which was kindly published by uHlanga, comes from the Latin word limen or limen, meaning a threshold, a transitional stage of a process, a position on a threshold. And in anthropology, liminality is the quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs in a ritual when a participant is in transition between who they were and who they will become. And one can think of the poem I read earlier, Epithalamium, in just such terms. But one can also think of, in a way, any poem as being liminal, that you enter at one point, you go into a threshold state, you face two ways, the beginning and the end. It should disorient you being in there. You should be surprised and charmed by the ambiguity, and come out the other end enriched, hopefully. So the poem to represent this collection, the collection of liminal, is a poem written for my friend Gus Ferguson, who sadly passed away in 2020. I have a habit of losing friends. Yeah. The poem uses a strange form of rhyme. I call it rhyming, but it's not rhyming. It's not by sound, but it's rhyming by image. And the rhyming is a way of linking stanzas together. So it's a kind of image linking to create a movement through stanzas and to create a narrative arc through a poem. Surrounded by Mountains for Gus Ferguson, Franschhoek 2014. A plume of smoke is rising into cloud. The cloud descends below the forest line. The trees are ghosts of shadows and lost light. The light fades fast until you cannot see. Beyond the angled roofs across the town, the windows of a house flare into flame. As one last flash of sunlight from the past leads you to the thought of what's beyond. Long, deep valleys carved by untold time. You had a destination once, but now that's lost beneath the weight of fallen leaves. Instead, you wait alone and watch for clues to what gives all the light and clouds and trees, the smoke and flying range of sawtooth peaks, meanings that will hold against the storm, the coming of which you've seen the early signs. A plume of smoke is rising into cloud. The slight wind whirls it round and round and round. This is from a collection, from the most recent collection, A Short Treatise on Mortality, again published by uHlanga in 2022. A number of poems that I've written present, as I said, present the muse as an actual character. And the one who is the speaking character of this poem, it also fits with the Pessoan sense of being inhabited by what I call imago poets, who use one as a writing vehicle. Here we have the muse chastising the writer for his absence, in part, I suppose, referring to the years I spent AWOL from the hard work of swimming in the sea of words. And the poem is called Poetry, and it's the muse speaking. I've seen you loitering on the corner again. You ditch me for months, years, then reappear, expecting me to swan around with you, that I can just be picked up where you left off and went silent, stopped scratching in the half light with a rusty nib. You can't. By now you know it's all or nothing with me. Not just when it suits you to put on your dancing shoes. This is a lifelong adventure, buddy boy, nothing less, and it costs everything you have to give and then some. That's the deal. You know it's so. Don't feign it. There are no rewards except my embrace, my curves, the shape of me when you run your hands up and down in search of a formula, again and again, only to discover there isn't one. There never has been. Everything is new. Learning to let go is the trick. I'll do the lifting for you, as long as I have your undying allegiance, your love. With that in hand, I'll let you loiter all day long. And then finally, something new and perhaps pertinent today. I inherited a book of poems by Louis MacNeice from Jonty Driver. And a poem in that collection triggered a poem which, if I'm lucky in all sorts of ways, will one day be in a new collection. And the poem is called From Posterity and begins with an epigram from MacNeice's collection, a poem. He wrote a poem called To Posterity, in which these two lines appear. When books have all seized up like books in graveyards, and reading and even speaking have been replaced. That's from his poem called To Posterity. So my response is from posterity. Nearly 60 years ago, the poet Louis MacNeice, in his 1958 collection, Visitations, Faber, suggested that a time would come when books and reading were no longer the essential way we learn to be, as each of us in turn constructs a life by living in the world, an example, perhaps, of poetry's strange ability to very occasionally give one insight into where the world and one is headed, presenting glimmers of a future that will come to pass long after one's essential dust has reclaimed its rightful place as universal stuff. And that's it. That's time up, I think.
Thank you, Douglas. That was wonderful. I particularly enjoyed the unwritten letter, um, the unwritten and the unsent, and generally unexisting. It was really lovely. Thank you so much. Um, if we have questions, I would be happy to have them now. We have lots of people. You can just raise your hand or start talking if you wish. Everybody's shy. Ah,
Oh,
Jacques, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, wonderful. Douglas, I loved your reading. I always do, and I was particularly moved by that first poem about all the things that you can do with anger, to get rid of it or to transmute it, to transform it. And I'm very struck by um, kind of tension that a kind of wonderful tension that I pick up. Your poems are very aware of current events, events that are unfolding at the time they are written. And they speak of those things, and at the same time, there's a pull towards something that is other, that speaks of poetry in and of itself. But it's very hard for me to put that into words tonight. But I wonder if you can say something about that pull in your own work, sort of towards saying something about what's happening, being involved, and at the same time, something that wants to make music, that wants to not stand apart from that, but that is different. That's as well as I can do. Can you do better?
I think I think gosh, how to express this? I think the personal is literally just that. It's the personal. It's a limited sphere, and one is always at risk in writing anything of diarizing one's life.
Mm.
Um, I know other writers have talked about cannibalizing one's life, but I think it's only worthy of poetry if you transform life. And that's the alchemical idea again, of transforming dirt into gold, or the transformation of things. So each of us, each of us lives in a historical moment,
Mm.
and what one sees, if one has spent any time studying history, that the same patterns get repeated over and over. Human beings don't seem to change that much, despite the context constantly transforming, constantly changing. Much of how things are at the moment, much of what aggravates and causes despair in us, the Romans knew only too well, and the Greeks before them. And when things go wrong and people get agonized by them and made anxious by them and made angry by them, and my standard response is, well, how far back do you want to go? Because that's the truth of things. The same stuff happens over and over.
Mm.
And so being too focused on this here now, one is always at risk of not creating art, but creating diaristic, is there such a word, diaritic type records. So I think the job of the writer is to transform,
Mm.
to take what is here now and relate it to what is greater than that historical moment. I
I
hope
love
that
the way that you also bring in geological time to create, to deepen that perspective.
geology is wonderful. I, it saddens me that I discovered it so late in life, but I've read assiduously about geology, and um, there's a marvelous book called The Ends of the World. Not the end of the world, but the ends of the world. And it looks at the whole history of the planet in terms of its rise and fall and rise and fall and the great dying offs, the catastrophic losses of life in these specific periods, and all recorded in the historical layers and records of geologic time. And gosh, if I could, I found such joy in that, and I found such perspective and a sense of one's own being and one's own moment, that one is part of this great process. And yes, it's short and it's brutal at times, but it's also joyous. Yes, as Schiller described, what did he say of life is a small boy's shirt, short and beshitted.
Nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah. Nevertheless, it's up to each one of us to make something joyous of that lifetime, and to do one's best to create the kind of art that presents it to future generations in a greater way than simply recording.
Douglas, we have a question from Chris Murray.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Douglas. Thank you so much. Always enjoy your reading, often awed by most of the things that you write. So thank you so much for that. You mentioned an interruption in your writing during which you sought to find a new and another way to write. I'm kind of wondering, how would you describe the let's call it hiatus, or transformation and the post new way of writing of Douglas Skinner?
I think it's incumbent upon every writer to become their own sharpest critic. That's much more difficult than simply saying it. It's easy to say, very difficult to do, and requires a lot of study and a lot of thinking, and going to a lot of other writers and critics, and even those with whom one doesn't agree, and even those who would condemn one's own particular writing. And I think I reached a point in my own life, perhaps, where the engines, the muscles of what informed my writing had perhaps worn a bit thin and weren't quite doing what I understood I needed. And my own sense of self and the world had changed quite dramatically with familial responsibilities. And so I think such a fallow period was made necessary, and from the outside it seems imposed. It seems as if it's imposed upon one, but it's not, in a way, because everything that I tried to write just was apparent to me it wasn't working, and so I stopped trying. And I embedded myself in a lot of reading and a lot of walking and a lot of thinking to find a new way to write. And that eventually started to come. And at the time I was living in a suburb of London called St. Margaret's, and I used to spend a lot of time walking along the Thames and around the town of Richmond. And I started to simply record those walks and to record the music I was listening to, and record the books that I was reading, and some of the people that I encountered, and some of what I was reading in the newspapers as the sense of the world. And out of that came a very odd little book, which I called Walking Don, because one of the characters I used to take with me on my walks was the imago, as it were, of Don McLennan, because I would talk to him as I walked, as one of my oldest friends. And that enabled me to, as it were, rejig my imagination, not in any organized way, really in just a stumbling way in which I began to see more clearly how all writing is fiction, all language is made up, all human existence is inside the shell of language. We don't live in the world, we live inside language. We are infinite creators because language is an infinite thing. There are endless variations on, you can have a component of 1,000 words and you can create a huge number of variations, huge number of sentences out of that. And so that slowly I developed this theory of the muse. I personified the muse as a way to make sense of what inspiration was. And that brought a different kind of writing. I think I shed a lot of the early symbolist influence, and took on board certain American writers in which there has always been a very solid foundation in the story, in the narrative. And that if you can tell a clear, cogent story, but do it while singing, that's as much as you need for a poem. And if you open yourself up to that process, then all the additional symbolist and hermetic ideas will come through. But having the spine, that spine of language and knowledge and narrative of story, and we tell stories because we are stories. I'm a made-up story. You, Chris, are a made-up story, and you make yourself up every day. You wake up in the morning and, oh, hey, it's the world. Hi, Chris, let's get up. You know, if you're really good with poetry, if you're clever with poetry, and you've finished working on a poem for a day, and you put it aside, wait a couple of days, and then pick it up again, and you'll find you're a different person, and you see the poem differently. And if you keep repeating that process over and over, you can bring 50 versions of Douglas Skinner to the poem. And hopefully at the end you get a better poem. So I think a lot of the fallow period was spent scratching around the world of critics, understanding technique, understanding language, understanding far more possibilities in the construction of meaning. But at the same time, understanding that everything that we know is predicated by the spine of narrative.
Thanks, Douglas. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was really very enlightening. I must say, as a person who doesn't write very much, very often, it's also very encouraging to find you can have a whole fallow period and then pick up again and do something quite different, and very beautifully and productively as well.
I have to say one thing. I'm very remiss in not mentioning this earlier, but I have to say that I do owe a great deal to my life partner for having supported me through that time, psychologically and emotionally and in life, and having that narrative, that spine. I was immensely lucky. You know, life is filled with great randomness, and luck and chance, and so I have that to be hugely thankful for.
Ed, would you like to ask your question?
Hey, thank you, Megan. Thank you, Douglas. It was a treat just to hear the poems from all those books. Something special about that. I don't know if I have questions, but perhaps I'll get there. Just deeply rewarding always to hear you. And two of the things that struck me this evening, just the way you evoke the transient, and whether it's transience, our existence, or the transient nature of the self. And that was there in so many of the poems. So my immediate thought as I'm rambling on is that the poems themselves are just so much more eloquent than any discussion, but perhaps there's something you'd want to say in response to that. And then I'm always intrigued by the poems in which you address the nature of writing. It's there in the poem To the Beloved. You speak of that which is always just beyond reach. Okay, I think I'll leave it for there. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Just to say that I am smoke, we are smoke, the world is smoke, here today, gone tomorrow. That's the reality of our being, our existence. And we We scribble madly trying to get something down that might last. That's our nature.
I hear you.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I'm Smoke. We have another question from Julene. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. You can go ahead. Okay, maybe Julene has stepped away. Otherwise, we have a question from Ian Bell.
Hi, Douglas. It's actually from me, Dawn. Yeah, beautiful reading. Thank you. I really appreciated that, your contribution to this world, this mysterious world of poetry. I'm interested in poets who write prose because they often do it with a musicality that is so lovely on the ear. And this may be a very ignorant question, but have you written prose? And where do we find it? And if not, why not? Well, why poetry and not prose?
In a buff folder at home. That's where you find it. I've tried. I tried writing a book of short stories or recording moments in my life that seemed to have an interesting story-like character about them. But I think the fatal mistake that was made very early on when I was in matric and I sent a prose piece in. I was a joint winner of an under-17 short story competition when I was 13 years old at Kimberley Boys High. A friend of mine in my class was a chap called John Stretch. And John and I were joint winners of the Northern Cape under-17 short story writing competition. He was 14 and I was 13. And he wrote a proper short story and I wrote a long poem of about 30 verses. No idea what it was like, but it was written as a piece of fiction in a shaped form. And in Standard 10, I wrote a piece for the school magazine called Dusk Over the Sea because I was living in East London and we'd spend an awful lot of time on Nahoon Beach, hanging around with the surf lifesavers and so I wrote this poem about dusk over the Nahoon Beach. And for whatever reason I do not know, I ended up converting Dusk Over the Beach into a poem, which I lost. And I lost. And when I moved out of home, a friend helped me to move. This was in my first year out of school, and I was off to become an accountant, and I signed up with an accounting firm as an article clerk. So I was going to live in a boarding house, and he came to help me, and he bumped into an écriteur, and out from behind the écriteur fell this poem that I'd written and lost. And he said, "Oh, you write poems?" And a typical South African male, said, "No, not really, no." He said, "Well, I do." And that's sort of how, these funny, odd little things kicked it all off. So it was set very early. I like to occasionally write the bits and pieces of critical prose because it teaches one how to think, or it forces one to think clearly and logically. But I'm not, poetry is fiction. It is a form of fiction. I'm not good at writing novels and short stories. I've loved reading them all my life. I can recall sitting with my thumb out, sitting on my suitcase in Mossel Bay for hours with my thumb out, hitchhiking to Cape Town, utterly engrossed in Kafka's short stories. I mean, so engrossed that I didn't care whether I got a lift or not. I just sat there with my thumb out and read Kafka. But, not my bag.
Thank you, Douglas. That was a wonderful answer. We have another question. Julene, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I finally managed to figure out the new phone and microphone. Um, I want to link back to Douglas' quiet period, and he and I've spoken about it before, and I've been having my own struggles. But I actually want to link it to something. So I like thinking a lot about how our brains work, and it's I find it quite lovely and coincidental that Douglas mentioned his stint in accounting or bookkeeping, and the parallel also to Pessoa, who worked for much of his life as an accountant or as a bookkeeper. And the, the question that I have in my mind is how what we do with our thoughts, with our thinking, and what we feed it with, whether it's with landscape, any other sensory experiences, does not involve the eyes, but maybe touch or shape or taste. If that is not what we're yearning for, I can say, Douglas, that tonight, I think I've even admitted that for a very long time I struggled to get quiet enough to read other people's poetry, to hear other people's work. And tonight was, to me, truly, it was like water. It's like good, fresh water. It doesn't even have to be from a mountain. It was just good, pure water. And why I mention it is because for the past 6 weeks, I have abused my brain working in accountancy again, in the very frenetic environment and dysfunctional environment of filmmaking. And I found that it's 4 days now since I've stopped working. So for the past 6-7 weeks, I've literally been dreaming accounting every night. So whether I'm walking on a path in my dream, whether I'm building a chair, whether I'm playing hide and seek, whether I'm gardening, everything is linked to some of the accounting processes, like it's grooved into my brain, and that there's no other way for my brain currently to think or to interpret what's around me than the pattern I've forced it to live by over the past 6 weeks. And my question then to you, Douglas, is apart from the reading that you did and the other ways that you found that you created to bring the muse back as a kind of a person or a tool, and how you informed your brain, I have a question whether what we allow our minds to be busy with, and that's whether it's fear or whether it's comparison, or if that might also be affecting whether and what we write, whether we risk and be playful, so it's kind of the diet that we allow our senses and our brains, or a way of constructing language. If we keep in mind that we need to nurture there, that we need to be playful, protective, adventurous, rather than feeling like dutiful poets or someone who needs to, that the next thing we write or make needs to be lasting and beautiful. I hope some of the question comes across.
Sure. I do not regard poetry as a career, and I think anyone who thinks it is really barking up the wrong tree. I think everyone who writes really needs a job. You need to support yourself in the world in an honest way. And yes, everything we do does inform our lives, but obviously one can counterweigh against that. I think it's tremendously important to have a ritual So the poem I wrote called December New York Bay was about a Jewish ritual of cleansing, where you go to a body of water and you cast bits of bread onto the water and you ritually cast out your sins. So it's a ritual of cleansing, and you can construct that in as a part of your life every single day. You carve out 15 minutes, come what may, and you say, I'm going to read a poem and I'm going to think about that poem, how it's constructed, what the technique is. So, like a motor mechanic, you take the engine apart and see how it's put together. Or you can sit and meditate for 15 minutes, or you can read a passage from like a manual. You can, whatever it is that you do, you have to do it in a fairly religious way. I mean, I happen to carve such time for myself either early in the morning or last thing at night, because one has to work for a living. You have to. Wallace Stevens was an insurance executive lifelong, and yet he produced one of the five great bodies of work in poetry, in the English poetry in the 20th century. So, Eliot was worked in a bank and then worked for Faber and Faber until he fell off his horse. So I think all of us you have to become divided. This is the world. I mean, it all has these religious overtones of, this is the world demands this and God demands that. And don't be attached to the world is really, I think, the key. And don't be attached to what you write, because sooner or later, time will show it up. Just right, regardless. And whatever comes out, comes out. It is what it is. Que sera, sera. There's no special secret. It's literally having whatever your own cleansing ritual is, but sticking to it, whatever works for you. I have noticed the way that brains work is there are a great many sub-sectors in a brain, and brains work through the heavy neural interconnection. One of the reasons why brains are so sophisticated computationally is that these sub areas are so heavily interconnected. Well, as a result of that, as the brain is dealing with the daytime world, let's call it, there is a great deal of chatter that goes on at a neurological level. I call it chatter, but it's electrochemical signaling, constant. And to be immersed in that is taxing. And so what I find is I have my own little ritual in which I shift that brain wave into a more of an alpha wave. And I can, and by so doing, and one of the techniques is breath listening. It's an old technique. You listen to your breath for 15 minutes or half an hour. And when you get good at that, you find that suddenly the chatter stops, and it's as if the water's gone over a waterfall and there's a different sound. And that, in a way, prepares you for a different kind of feeling, thinking, creating. So, but there are many ways of doing that. That's just a thing that I've discovered, that I can actually be working to still the chatter, and I literally, it's like falling over a waterfall, and it goes, and the chatter stops. And that helps a great deal.
Wow. I imagine that it does. And I think we're probably all of us sitting here thinking, I must try that. I must do it more daily. I must, take Douglas's example, it's a fantastic description of turning off the chatter. I think we're going to conclude that wonderful Q&A session with just thank you so much. It was really wonderful. It's a fantastic reading, and round of applause all round. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone for attending.
Yeah,
It's lovely to have you in the room together.
Thank you, Douglas. I'm going to stop recording then, and we'll have a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes break, and then we'll have our open mic session. And I hope we'll all stay. Thank you.